Welcome to the deep dive. I think we've all had that moment where you're like, is this Wi-Fi thing messing with me? It's like this invisible force field. Today, we're diving deep into that question, the potential effects of Wi-Fi on our bodies and minds.
It really is fascinating, right? And you've pulled together some great sources that'll let us tackle this from a couple angles. We can look at the hard science. What are the studies saying? What are the biological mechanisms they're investigating?
Right, and there's the human side of it. People who say, hey, I'm really feeling something from this EMF exposure, and that whole electromagnetic hypersensitivity thing.
Exactly. And I think it's important for everyone listening to know up front, we're not here to say definitively Wi-Fi is good or Wi-Fi is bad. It's more about, okay, what does the current research suggest? What questions are still out there?
Yeah, let's bring some clarity to this whole thing without getting too jargony. So, where do we even start with all this?
Well, let's define what we're talking about. Wi-Fi, also sometimes called WLAN, short for Wireless Local Area Network, is basically how your devices, like your phone or laptop, connect to the internet without wires. And this connection relies on signals transmitted using pulsed electromagnetic frequencies, or EMFs.
Ah, EMFs. There's that buzzword. And that's where a lot of the controversy kicks in, right?
Definitely. You'll see research suggesting that exposure to these EMFs from Wi-Fi could be a problem. Like it could have some negative health effects, but then other studies are saying these signals are too weak to do any real damage. So it's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay, so how do we impact this? What are some of the specific things researchers are looking at when it comes to potential Wi-Fi effects?
One of the big areas they focus on is this idea of oxidative stress. Some scientists believe that exposure to EMFs from Wi-Fi might boost the production of these things called free radicals in our bodies.
Free radicals, that sounds kind of ominous. What exactly are they?
Think of them like these tiny little unstable molecules that can cause damage to cells. Like they can mess with proteins, fats, even our DNA. So if there's more of these free radicals floating around, that oxidative stress, it could potentially lead to, various health problems down the line. But it's important to note here, a lot of these studies are done in a lab setting.
Right, so not necessarily reflecting what's happening to us when we're just chilling at home with our Wi-Fi on.
Exactly. So while it's a possible pathway, it's not like a guaranteed outcome just from using your home Wi-Fi. It's just something researchers are looking into.
Got it. So besides those free radicals, what other areas are raising eyebrows in the research world?
Reproductive health is another one. We're seeing some studies, both with animals and some with humans, that suggest there could be potential impacts on male sperm.
Whoa, really? That sounds pretty serious.
Yeah.
What kind of effects are we talking about here?
So they're looking at things like sperm count, their ability to move properly, and even the integrity of their DNA. There was this systematic review by Jafar in 2019 that looked at all the available evidence on male reproductive effects.
What did they find? Is it conclusive?
Well, it's not a slam dunk. While some studies did show some links, many of them involved exposing subjects to much higher levels of EMFs than what we'd normally experience. And the results across the board weren't totally consistent. But there's enough there to make researchers keep digging.
I can see why.
Yeah.
It's not just the guys, right? I think there was something in the research about potential impacts on women's reproductive systems, too.
Yeah, there are some studies suggesting that exposure to EMFs could affect hormones like estrogen and progesterone. The idea is that this could potentially mess with fertility and maybe even increase the risk of chromosomal abnormalities.
So some pretty fundamental biological stuff is under investigation. What about our brains? I think that's the big one that freaks people out.
For sure, and animal studies have been giving us some interesting clues, although it's not always straightforward. Like, there was a study by Othman in 2017 where they exposed rats to stress and Wi-Fi radiation, and they found that it seemed to trigger some anxiety-like behavior in those rats.
So a link between EMFs and anxiety in rats. But how does that translate to us humans, walking around with our smartphones and using Wi-Fi at home?
It's a good question. We can't just directly apply those findings to humans, but at a biological level, the study showed some changes in the rats' brains. They saw increased oxidative stress in the cerebral cortex, which is a really important part of the brain, and higher activity of an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which is involved in how our nerve cells talk to each other.
Wow, so actual changes in the brain. Okay, but what about more everyday concerns, like does using Wi-Fi mess with our sleep, our memory?
There have been some links found between high levels of Wi-Fi exposure and problems with learning, memory, sleep, and even feeling tired all the time. One theory is that it might be messing with our melatonin levels, that's the hormone that regulates our sleep-wake cycle, and maybe increasing norepinephrine, which is a stress hormone, especially at night.
So less sleep hormone, more stress hormone. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for feeling crummy. But isn't screen time in general linked to those same issues, regardless of Wi-Fi?
That's the tricky part. It's really hard to separate out the effects of Wi-Fi from just generally using screens a lot. So it's not like we can say Wi-Fi is the sole culprit here. More research is needed to tease all that apart.
Right, it's all intertwined with our modern, tech-obsessed lives.
Yeah.
What about those studies where they actually measure brain activity, like EEGs? What are they showing?
Those have been a bit of a mixed bag. Some EEG studies have suggested that there might be some neuropsychiatric changes associated with Wi-Fi exposure, but others, like a study by Zentai in 2015, didn't find any immediate effects on brain activity or alertness after exposure to Wi-Fi.
Okay, so not a clear-cut answer from the EEG studies either. But wait, I think you mentioned one study that actually found a potential benefit from Wi-Fi. That's kind of surprising.
Yeah, it is interesting. This was a study by Banisher back in 2013. They found that mice with a condition similar to Alzheimer's actually seemed to show some improvement in their cognitive function after prolonged exposure to Wi-Fi radiation.
Whoa, that's a huge curveball. So Wi-Fi as a potential therapy for Alzheimer's.
Hold on, it's just one study, and it was in mice, so way too early to jump to any conclusions about humans. But it does show that the effects of EMFs might not all be negative, which makes this whole thing even more complex.
Definitely makes you think. What about kids? I know a lot of parents are worried about the effects of all this technology on their children.
It's a valid concern. There was a study in 2019 by Guxons that looked at young kids. They didn't find any link between the EMFs from cell phones and cordless phones and emotional or behavioral problems in the kids.
That's somewhat reassuring.
Eh.
But there was a catch, right?
Yeah, they did find something interesting. They noticed that higher levels of EMF exposure from cell phone base stations, like the big towers, during the mother's pregnancies were associated with more behavioral and emotional issues reported by the moms when the kids were young.
So a possible link between prenatal EMF exposure and later behavioral problems.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. And it highlights how much we still don't know about the long-term effects, especially for developing kids.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier that a lot of these studies use higher levels of EMFs than we'd normally encounter. Why is that so important to consider?
It's super important because it basically means we can't necessarily apply those findings directly to our everyday lives. Like, if they're blasting those lab rats with super high levels of EMFs, it doesn't mean the same thing will happen to us sitting in our living rooms with our Wi-Fi router.
Right. It's all about context. So we need more studies that use realistic levels of exposure to get a better picture of what's really going on.
Exactly. And the international safety guidelines for EMFs are actually set much higher than the levels typically produced by our home Wi-Fi networks. So even if there are risks, we might be well below those thresholds.
That's good to know. Okay, so we've talked about some of the observed effects, but how might these EMFs actually be messing with our bodies at a cellular level?
Well, one of the leading theories is this thing called calcium overload. A bunch of researchers, particularly Dr. Martin Pall, have been digging into this. The idea is that a lot of the biological effects we're seeing could be due to these things called voltage-gated calcium channels, or VGCCs for short, getting overactivated.
Okay, voltage-gated calcium channels. I'm already lost. Break it down for me.
Imagine these tiny little gates on the surface of your cells. They control how much calcium gets inside. And these gates are really sensitive to electrical changes. The theory is that EMFs from Wi-Fi could be messing with those gates, making them open up more than they should. And that lets too much calcium flood into the cell.
So it's like an electrical glitch that screws up the calcium flow. But why is too much calcium a bad thing?
Well, think of it like this. Calcium is really important for our cells, but too much of it can trigger all sorts of problems. One thing that can happen is it can cause the cells to produce too much nitric oxide, or NO. Now, NO has some important functions in the body, but in excess, it can start to inhibit things like energy production in the mitochondria, which are like the powerhouses of our cells.
So not only do we have those free radicals running amok, but now our cells are struggling to make energy.
Yeah, it's like a double whammy. And that's not all. The excess NO can also mess with the production of hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone.
Which could explain some of those potential reproductive effects we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And then to make matters worse, that superoxide, the free radical we talked about, can react with the NO and form something called peroxynitrite, which is an even nastier free radical. This peroxynitrite can cause a ton of damage to cells and tissues and might also be a factor in increasing inflammation in the body. It's like a chain reaction of bad stuff.
It's amazing how everything's connected. So this whole calcium overload thing is a potential explanation for how EMFs might be affecting us. But like you said earlier, more research is definitely needed to confirm all this. Now, let's shift gears and talk about electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS. What exactly is this condition?
EHS is basically when people experience a whole bunch of symptoms that they believe are caused by exposure to EMFs, things like cell phones, Wi-Fi, power lines, that kind of stuff. It's also sometimes called IEI, EMF, which stands for idiopathic environmental intolerance attributed to electromagnetic fields. But here's the key takeaway: no matter what the cause is, these symptoms are very real and can really impact people's lives.
So it's not like people are faking it, even if the science hasn't fully figured it out yet.
Right, and that's why the WHO recognizes it as a real health concern.
Okay, so what kind of symptoms are we talking about here? It seems like a pretty broad range.
Yeah, it varies a lot from person to person, but some of the common ones are headaches, fatigue, dizziness, and skin problems like redness, tingling, or a burning sensation.
I feel like those could be symptoms of a lot of different things. What else?
Lots of people also complain about sleep problems like insomnia and difficulty concentrating. Some experience muscle and body pain, kind of like fibromyalgia and tinnitus, which is that ringing in the ears.
So lots of potential neurological and sensory stuff going on. Anything else?
Yeah, they also report things like confusion, mood swings, depression, irritability, and in more extreme cases, even suicidal thoughts. Some have problems with memory, balance, and are super sensitive to sound. And then there's a whole other category called idiopathic environmental intolerance, or IEI, which includes EHS. People with IEI sometimes have more general symptoms like rapid heartbeat, chest pain, sweating, shortness of breath, nausea, and even a choking feeling.
Wow, so a really wide range of possible symptoms. It's got to be really tough for people dealing with this. But it sounds like while these symptoms can be super disruptive, they're not usually life-threatening, right?
That's right. For the most part, they're not considered medically serious in the sense of being life-threatening. But if someone is experiencing really severe symptoms like a super fast heart rate, difficulty breathing, or they can't stop vomiting, they definitely need to seek medical attention right away.
Yeah, of course. Those could be signs of a completely different problem that needs urgent care. Now, what are some of the things that might make someone more likely to experience these EHS symptoms?
Well, there are a few things that seem to play a role. People who are generally sensitive to stress or who have a lot of anxiety about health issues, especially those related to EMFs, seem to be more prone to reporting EHS symptoms.
So that kind of makes sense. If you're already stressed and worried about EMFs, you might be more likely to notice and attribute any physical sensation to them.
Right. And it's not intentional, it's just how our brains work. We tend to focus on things that we're already anxious about.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about underlying mental health conditions? Could those be contributing factors?
Definitely. There's a pretty strong overlap between EHS and conditions like somatic symptom disorder, which is when someone experiences a lot of physical symptoms that don't necessarily have a clear medical cause.
So the symptoms are real, but the root of the problem might be more psychological.
Yeah, it's not about saying the symptoms aren't real, it's just trying to understand the bigger picture. And there are other conditions like OCD, anxiety disorders, phobias, even paranoia that have been linked to EHS. Some people even develop a fear of leaving their homes because they're so worried about EMF exposure.
So it can be a really complex interplay of physical sensations, psychological factors, and even social anxieties. Now, you mentioned a connection to multiple chemical sensitivity, or MCS, earlier. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, studies have shown that a good chunk of people who report being sensitive to EMFs also report having MCS, which is basically when people have bad reactions to even tiny amounts of certain chemicals that most people don't even notice.
Like what kind of chemicals are we talking about here?
Oh, all sorts of things. Cleaning products, gasoline fumes, car exhaust, pesticides, even strong scents like perfumes or air fresheners.
And what happens when people with MCS are exposed to those things?
They can have all kinds of reactions: nausea, skin rashes, headaches, trouble breathing, watery eyes. It's kind of like an allergy attack. And just like with EHS, there's a lot of debate about what causes MCS. Is it physical, psychological, or a bit of both?
So two conditions with a lot of unknowns and a lot of overlap. But here's the million-dollar question. Has science actually proven a direct link between EMFs and EHS?
That's the tricky part. Despite a ton of research, including nearly 50 really well-controlled studies, we haven't been able to consistently show that EMFs actually cause the symptoms people with EHS report.
Wait, so how did they test this?
In these studies, they expose people who say they have EHS to EMFs in a controlled environment, But they do it in a way where neither the person nor the researchers know when the EMFs are actually on.
Ah, a blind study. So if the person only reports symptoms when they think the EMFs are on, but not when they're actually on, that kind of weakens the case for a direct link.
Exactly, and that's generally what they've found. The results haven't really backed up the idea that EMFs are the direct trigger for these symptoms.
So that's got to be frustrating for people who are really suffering from these symptoms.
It is. It's important to remember that just because we haven't found a consistent link in a lab setting doesn't mean those symptoms aren't real or that people aren't genuinely experiencing them.
Right. It just means we don't fully understand the connection yet.
Exactly. And the World Health Organization actually recognizes that. Back in 2005, they acknowledged IEI-EMF, which remember is another name for EHS, as a legitimate health concern.
So even though the science is still out on the direct link between EMFs and EHS, the WHO is saying, hey, these symptoms are real and people are struggling, so we need to take it seriously.
Exactly.
Okay, so if it might not be a direct cause and effect thing with EMFs, what are some of the other explanations researchers are exploring?
Well, one possibility is that there are subtle biological changes happening in some people due to EMF exposure that we just haven't been able to detect yet with our current research methods.
So maybe the science just hasn't caught up yet.
Maybe. There's also the nocebo effect to consider.
Nocebo effect. Refresh my memory.
It's basically the opposite of the placebo effect. It's when something makes you feel worse because you believe it's harmful, even if it's not actually doing anything bad to you.
Oh, right. Like if someone tells you that a certain food will give you a headache, you might actually start getting headaches when you eat it, even if the food itself is harmless.
Exactly. And there's some evidence that this might be happening with EHS. Like in some studies, they found that people who were told they were being exposed to high levels of EMFs reported feeling worse, even when they weren't actually being exposed to anything.
Wow, so our beliefs can actually have a physical effect on us? That's wild. What other theories are out there?
There's the idea that some people might just have a more sensitive nervous system than others. Maybe their nervous system is more easily triggered. So even things that wouldn't bother most people, like low levels of EMFs, could set off a stress response in them.
So it's not that the EMS themselves are causing the problems, but they're acting as a trigger for an already sensitive system.
Exactly. There's also some research looking at inflammation. Some studies have found that people with EHS tend to have slightly higher levels of inflammatory markers and histamine in their blood. And of course, we can't forget about the possibility of other underlying medical conditions that might be contributing to the symptoms, things that maybe haven't been diagnosed yet.
So it's a complex puzzle with lots of potential pieces.
For someone who's dealing with these kinds of symptoms, when should they see a doctor?
If you're experiencing any symptoms that are worrying you or getting in the way of your life, it's always a good idea to see a doctor. It's important to rule out any other potential medical conditions that could be causing similar symptoms.
Right. Better safe than sorry.
Yeah.
What can someone expect if they go to the doctor with these concerns?
Well, since there's no specific test for EHS, it's usually a process of elimination. The doctor will talk to you about your symptoms, your medical history, do a physical exam, and probably run some blood tests to check for inflammation, histamine levels, or other things that might be going on.
And I imagine they'd also want to rule out things like allergies or autoimmune disorders, right?
Exactly. And depending on your symptoms, they might also refer you to a psychologist or psychiatrist for further evaluation.
It's important to point out that that doesn't mean they think it's all in your head. Right. Mental health professionals can be really helpful in diagnosing and treating conditions like depression and anxiety, which can play a big role in physical symptoms. And they can also teach you coping strategies to help you manage those symptoms, regardless of what's causing them.
So it's all about addressing the person's suffering and helping them feel better. What about treatments for EHS? What kind of approaches are used?
Well, the main goal is usually to improve the person's quality of life, help them feel less isolated, and reduce their tendency to avoid things that they think are triggering their symptoms.
Right, because if someone's constantly afraid of EMFs, they might start isolating themselves and avoiding all kinds of everyday activities, which can make things even worse.
Exactly. So treatment usually involves things like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, which can help people change their thinking patterns and develop better coping skills.
So kind of retraining your brain to not overreact to things that might not be actually harmful.
Right. Support groups can also be helpful because they give people a chance to connect with others who understand what they're going through. And it's also important to treat any other underlying medical conditions that might be contributing to the symptoms.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
What about things in the environment besides EMFs? Are there other factors that people who are sensitive to EMFs should be aware of?
Absolutely. Things like poor air quality, noise, bad lighting, and stressful environments can all make symptoms worse. So it's important to pay attention to those things too and see if making changes in your environment can help.
Right, it's all connected. Our environment has a huge impact on how we feel, both physically and mentally. Now, what about work? Are there any protections for people who feel like they have electromagnetic or chemical sensitivities at work?
Yeah, in a lot of places, there are laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act or ADA that protect people with disabilities, and that can include things like severe environmental sensitivities if they're making it hard for someone to do their job.
So if someone's sensitivities are really impacting their ability to work, their employer might have to make some adjustments to accommodate them.
That's right. It's called reasonable accommodations. The employee would usually need to talk to their HR department or someone who handles accommodations and explain how their sensitivities are affecting their work. Then they'd work together to figure out what kind of changes could be made.
What kind of accommodations are we talking about?
It could be things like asking coworkers to not use their cell phones during meetings, using a headset or speakerphone to stay further away from devices, moving the employee's workspace further from potential EMF sources, allowing them to work from home if possible, or giving them a wired internet connection instead of Wi-Fi.
So some pretty practical solutions that can make a big difference for someone who's struggling.
Definitely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. As we wrap things up, what are the key takeaways you'd want our listeners to remember about Wi-Fi and EHS?
The big thing is that while research is ongoing, we don't have a definitive answer yet on whether typical Wi-Fi exposure poses health risks. There are a lot of studies looking into it, but more research is needed, especially at realistic exposure levels.
Right, so don't panic, but stay informed and pay attention to the research as it evolves.
Exactly. And when it comes to EHS, the most important thing to remember is that the symptoms people are experiencing are real, and we need to take them seriously.
Even if we don't fully understand the cause yet.
Right. It's a complex issue, and there's still a lot we don't know.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners. As wireless technology becomes more and more prevalent, how do we strike that balance between reaping the benefits of connectivity and addressing potential concerns, both from a scientific perspective and from the lived experiences of people who are sensitive to EMFs? What kind of research would help us navigate this evolving landscape? It's something worth pondering.
Absolutely. We encourage you to check out the sources we've talked about today and keep thinking critically about your own environment and well-being. This is an ongoing conversation, and it's important to stay engaged.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.